Welcome to Why Is This Good, a podcast by the Naples Writers Workshop. I'm Christine and I'm here with John. Hey, John.
Hello.
Okay, it's your turn. Tell us about your story.
I picked the story Nine Lives by Ursula K. Le Guin. The hatch opened. The young man they had seen on the screen came out with one athletic twist and leaped down onto the shaky dust and clinkers of Libra. Martin shook his hand, but Pugh was staring at the hatch, from which another young man emerged with the same neat twist and jump, followed by a young woman who emerged with the same neat twist, ornamented by a wriggle and the jump. They were all tall, with bronze skin, black hair, high-bridged noses, epicanthic fold, the same face. They all had the same face. The fourth was emerging from the hatch with a neat twist and jump. Martin Bach, said Pugh, we've got a clone. Right, said one of them. We're a 10 clone. John Chow's the name. You're Lieutenant Martin? I'm Owen Pugh. Alvaro Guin Martin, said Martin, formal, bowing slightly. Another girl was out, the same beautiful face. Martin stared at her and his eye rolled like a nervous pony's. Evidently, he had never given any thought to cloning and was suffering technological shock. Steady, Pugh said in the Argentine dialect. It's only excess twins. He stood close by Martin's elbow. He was glad himself of the contact. It is hard to meet a stranger. Even the greatest extrovert meeting even the meekest stranger knows a certain dread, though he may not know he knows it. Will he make a fool of me, wreck my image of myself, invade me, destroy me, change me? Will he be different from me? Yes, that he will. There's the terrible thing, the strangeness of the stranger. After 2 years on a dead planet, and the last half year isolated as a team of two, oneself and one other, after that it's even harder to meet a stranger, however welcome he may be. You're out of the habit of difference. You've lost the touch. And so the fear revives, the primitive anxiety, the old dread. The clone, 5 males and 5 females, had got done in a couple of minutes what a man might have got done in 20. Greeted Pugh and Martin, had a glance at Libra, unloaded the boat, made ready to go. They went, and the dome filled with them, a hive of golden bees. They hummed and buzzed quietly, filled up all the silences, all spaces, with a honey-brown swarm of human presence. Martin looked bewildered at the long-limbed girls, and they smiled at him, 3 at once. Their smile was gentler than that of the boys, but no less radiantly self-possessed. Self-possessed, Owen Pugh murmured to his friend. That's it. Think of it. To be oneself 10 times over. 9 seconds for every motion. 9 eyes on every vote. It would be glorious. But Martin was asleep, and the John Chows had all gone to sleep at once. The dome was filled with their quiet breathing. They were young. They didn't snore. Martin sighed and snored. His Hershey bar-colored face relaxed in the dim afterglow of Libra's primary, set at last. Pugh had cleared the dome and stars looked in, Sol among them, a great company of lights, a clone of splendors. Pugh slept and dreamed of a one-eyed giant who chased him through the shaking halls of hell.
Okay, how'd you find this one? You said in this book that you've drawn a couple from, or?
Oh, I read this years ago.
Okay.
I actually tried to find it because we always do stories on the podcast that you can find online somewhere. And when we first started back with Rob, I tried to find the story online and couldn't find it. And so I just came to me like, oh, I should look for it again because it's been a few years and, sometimes things pop up. And apparently Baen Books had put out a book with a bunch of short stories in it, including this one. And one of the preview stories on their website was this one. So I was like, oh, here we go.
So you'd read it before, and we've read now. Is this our third Ursula story?
I think so. Unless I'm forgetting one. There's the Island of the Immortals, and there's the ones who come from Omelas, and then this one.
I'd have to reread those others, but I know having read her stuff now through this podcast that I like her, and when I see her referenced, she's still like a big name in this genre, and
yes,
she's a top dog.
Yeah, she's like one of the literary science fiction writers. Yeah.
Which is why someone like me who's not necessarily reading non-literary versions of this genre, is into her, and makes some of that other stuff palatable. This one was, maybe it's because there were so many characters, I was having trouble keeping a sense of which clone was which clone and how much it really mattered who was who. So it felt to me like maybe I was paying attention to the wrong aspects of the story until the point when we're down to one clone. That's when the story really kind of took off, right? That was when I understood where this was going and what was going to make it the literary science fiction story and not just the interesting.
I don't want to limit what happened early in the story to mere setup because there's more than just setup going on there. But yeah, it is basically it's setting up the accident that kind of ruins that experience for the one clone that remains. And so that's where the story really.
Yes. Yeah. You just don't know as the reader where it's going. interesting. Like,
Yeah.
at first, you wonder if this is going to be a story about the two humans that are stationed at this place having some kind of like personal revelation. And then when you find out that it's actually one of the clones that has the change of heart, I feel like this is the next like phase of Hollywood movies if they ever decide to write anything unique ever again, which would be that like, like AI becoming sentient, but also sympathetic. And we've seen that before, with like certain like kid movies and stuff. But I feel like that's what we're gonna see more and more of. And this, I ended up like really, really liking this because what we don't see is clone that readily adapts all of these human tendencies and assimilates and understands it. Like we see him become human because he ends up grieving. And it's something that like they're all kind of baffled by. It makes sense that you would grieve it though, because like all of the setup that we're talking about lays the groundwork for the fact that they might be most interested in talking to themselves and these other clones, but there's like a real community and bond going on there and a purpose. And when that's all stripped away, we have our one guy who's just completely lost and doesn't know how to interact with the other humans because he hasn't bothered.
It's an interesting kind of look at what comprises one's identity.
Yeah.
They consider themselves to be one, like they give themselves a single name, John Chow.
Yes.
That's all 10 of us are John Chow. And we're so genetically similar that we all have the same kind of feelings and reactions to things. There's one comment about like someone who like accidentally hit himself with a hammer when he was a kid. So he like had a discolored fingernail and like little things like that to distinguish them. But in general, they're all identical, genetically identical. So they have same behavioral traits and stuff, feelings, good at math. So they identify as a collective almost, even though they're like specific, like we don't have any kind of ESP or any kind of like telepathy or whatever. We just know each other so well because of how we're so closely genetically close that we can predict what each other are feeling or thinking in that way. And so for him to lose all that and then to have to be forced to like, instead of associating with those 9 people, associate with non-genetically identical people and try to like learn to be an individual. It's like that one story we did a million years ago, Greg Egan. It was about solipsism. And this is almost like another look at that kind of concept of solipsism. I don't know if you remember that story.
What was it called? Or
it's
what was
called
it
Closer,
about?
but it was about this like couple that was dating and they merged because they had chips in their brains, or their brains have been replaced by like some science fiction computer chip that like took on the functioning of their conscious experience. And
that was like one of our first ones.
It was very early.
Yeah.
But it like they merged their identities into a single chip. So they like felt as if they were one person for a while.
Yeah.
And so then they got separated again and they broke up because they're like, well, what's left? But it's like a similar kind of thing, but looking at it from a totally different angle.
Yeah, you're talking about like the identity and stuff. The other story that it reminded me of though was the Joseph Conrad story that we did. It was suggested by a reader.
It was Rob suggested that one.
Oh, that's right. So, that one is about two white men that have to like hold up a post where they're like surrounded by Native Americans and like hoping that like the mothership comes back for them. And instead, I'm pretty sure they freak out and kill each other. And at first, that's what this setup felt like. Like these two people who are primary at this base are going to get overrun by these clones in some way. Like we never see them like establishing the clones as a threat, but they do feel like they're so, like we said, sort of consumed by themselves. They like have an orgy with each other every night. And they're like, dude, what? Like, they're like, we don't want in on that, but this is kind of weird. And like the early on, like examples of like Calf, I think are like, he doesn't say things like good night. And they're like, dude, this is like polite human behavior. And he's like, what? Like, I don't have to say this to other people. And they're like, okay, fine, whatever. Like, they just seem so uninterested. So I was like, I read this with a little bit of like trepidation. I was like, oh man, like these clones are going to decide they don't need these people or that they're like so much better at this than they are or whatever. Like, I don't know, like they've been generated for this very purpose. They're so good at what they do that like, just let them do it. So I was also like pleased to see that it wasn't that.
Oh, yeah.
But I feel like it's still like playing with that idea, that like there's this otherness that you have to contend with somehow.
I mean, the section I read, he talked about like meeting a stranger and like what it's like to meet a stranger. And like, because the clones are because they have one another, they're not like an isolated individual. They're a collective. Even though they're not literally a collective, they behave as a collective because they understand each other so well. And so they don't need to reach out outside of that to like connect with other people because they can connect with each other.
Yeah. There's not even like one that they can decide they'll befriend, Anytime you meet a group of strangers, there's usually like one or two where you're like, okay, I like this person. man. None of these clones care.
Yeah, but I think in the two people that are there, Martin and Pugh, they have to wrestle with a kind of bigotry almost. Like
Yeah.
they're not sure what to do. Like what are you supposed to do with a clone? Like how do you live with a clone, like a group of
Yeah.
clones? It's not overt, right? It's like kind of understated, and it's also like you said, they are become their own. They've been there on the planet by themselves for so long. They've become their own kind of duo. So bringing this other collective into their situation kind of throws them off at the same time. But yeah, like you said, it's a lot of the confrontation of the other, of what otherness entails, whether it's cultural otherness, like the Native Africans, and which I remember the name of that story, the Joseph Conrad story, or if it's the otherness of like a different kind of existence in the clones,
Right.
kind of a different way of moving in the world. But then at the end, when they're talking about like, how does it feel to love somebody? And
Yeah.
you realize that, I forget which one, but when one of them gets caught in the earthquake and the other one runs out to save him, and he's like, I probably didn't need to. It's like, well, why did you do it? It's like, because I think I love him. So there's that kind of what is the nature of love, too, at the same time. You said they were having orgies every night, and the guy is like, well, I forget what he called it, but he's like, it's more like masturbation since like we're the
Yeah.
same person.
Yeah, I guess what's interesting about that is like at first when I read this, it was like, how is Calf going to love a human when he's lost the people closest to him, right? But it's even more than that. Like, I don't know that he ever defined his relationship with the clones as love or care. It was like something like that he just took for granted. It's almost like having a sibling, right? Like,
Yeah.
people just have siblings growing up, and maybe you're the kind of person that says like, oh, we were never close growing up. Then as adults, you realize like you have all of this and you're like you always had that. It's just you're realizing that this person to you is a person and not just a sibling. Like these clones were not just clones, they were people to you.
Yeah. It's not just that doll you pull out of the closet every
No.
afternoon to play with. It's
Right. And like Calf is almost forgetting that because it was effortless with these clones to feel as connected as he did, that
yeah.
was something that took the effort that he's seeing in Martin and Pugh.
Yeah. Being able to connect.
Yeah, I'm like skimming the ending again here, and like it's almost like more heartening to think that Calf has always had this ability. He just didn't know what it was. Now that he has to make an effort to like love another person that's like foreign to him, a stranger. Like he's having to love strangers now instead of just like siblings or himself or clones. Because he's seeing that like Martin and Pugh are just colleagues, essentially. But like a lot of these sci-fi things, if you're like astronauts together, like in all these movies and stuff, like they're your only buddy, your only other human.
Yeah.
You might hate their guts, but there's also like a love there.
It's very interesting. Like there's the story seems to be about kind of relationships. So you have the clones set up as like one side of things. You have the two guys on the planet who've been isolated together for a very long time, and they've got their relationship and like how you connect with other people and like what can build out of that. But it's all being governed by this kind of like this corporate thing, like this company that's like sending them out to gather uranium, I think, on other planets, and like how much value there is in the stuff they're mining that they'll just throw these people at them. And we just lost 9 out of 10 clones, and it doesn't matter because we'll just send some more. We really need that ore.
Yeah.
So that's like kind of inhuman, and then
Right.
there's human things happening under that rubric. So that's a whole other level. Like the relationships that are being set up are artificial in that way. They're just being like, we're just hurling people into space, and they have to like bump into each other and then live together. And what happens?
At the end there too, like they're talking about how a 12 clone is going to come in.
Yeah.
And they're like, Calf, you don't have to stay. Like if you want to go back, like you don't have to work with another 12 clone, which is so funny because like what a weird thing to like get off the hook for. Like if we were hiring more people, my boss wouldn't be like, you can quit. You know what I mean? Like,
Oh, I mean, yeah.
ideally, I still have a job to do, right? Like it's just they can do it better, and like you're not as helpful now because you're missing like your other parts.
You had a horrible accident. Now you're just a head in a jar.
Yeah.
We're going to bring in someone who has a whole body.
Yeah,
so if you don't
exactly.
want to work next to someone who still has their body, like we understand.
We understand, and also we don't care what you do next because you're useless going forward.
Yeah,
Like
that's right.
you were a
We'll
part
put
of a
you out by the
whole.
street.
Yeah, like it's a weird thing to be like, you don't have to be here. It's like, well, what else am I made for? I was made for this specific thing.
Oh, yeah.
Like I was made to do the work. And like that's part of what gets Calf out of his funk is like doing work. He's grieving so much he stops eating and he's like losing weight and he's just like listless. And then he finally starts like going through stuff and then he offers to like do a job and he's not like gung ho about it, but it's like something to pass the time with, which like humanizes him pretty quickly, right? The fact that he's like despondent and has to be taken out of it versus just like that he's a machine that would work through the grief or work through it in a way that made you wonder if he was affected by this at all, you know?
Well, when I was trying to think of an analogy for you, for it's a single human existence without the clone things, I said head in a jar because what is the analogy, right?
Yeah.
He's lost every other person in his little collective,
Right.
his little clone company. So he has no connection to that, like no external connection to what that was before.
Right.
So the only thing I thought of was like, you'd have to be literally just your head because you don't have your arms, you don't have your legs, you don't have your intestines.
Yeah, yeah. All the other parts that are like necessary. So I ended up really liking the ending then. And like I said, I was glad to see that this is where that story was going once we had that accident. And you realized that this was going to be a story about the clones having a revelation versus humans having a revelation and a story about like love.
Yeah.
When sci-fi does that, I feel like in particular, it's a genre that like can surprise me with that kind of like tenderness, you know, because you're expecting cold, calculated scientific facts. Yeah, it's a more powerful twist almost every time.
That's kind of related to what I think my takeaway is going to be, but there's one thing that I think Ursula Le Guin does really well. Like some of these other science fiction, like the Greg Egan story I talked about earlier, did this too, but some science fiction will look at the science of it all. And like,
Yes.
that's the interesting thing. But
Right.
her stories are always back to like the human kind of moral conflict. She'll create these interesting situations like the Omelas, the city that's
Right.
built on one person's suffering. It's a utopia, except one person has to suffer. One child has to suffer. The island of the immortals. Like, what if you did live forever? What if there were immortal creatures that could not die despite all the injuries of life? And this one, I don't think I have the definition of this right, but there's this thing called post-human. And the way I understand post-human is like when science takes kind of like what human beings are and like moves past it, like moves us into a different phase of human experience because of the scientific thing. Like the Greg Egan story where you can replace your consciousness with a computer, or like this where you can live your life as clones, like, you know, extended indefinitely into the future as clones, or whatever it is that kind of like puts us into a new realm of experience. What does that do to human life, to human experience? And what this story does, and what I think Le Guin always does, is brings it back to like the human experience.
Right.
It's a way of like looking beyond our current lives at things that give us insight into that life, nonetheless, into where we are. So like love, connection, like meeting a stranger, what that's like. The John Chow experience is like you never have to meet a stranger because you always have other versions of yourself to live with.
Yes.
Until they're gone, now you have to meet a stranger for real this time.
Right.
Like things like that get to be explored because of this setup that she does.
Right. I remember like we shared forever ago in one of our newsletters an article, and there's millions differentiating like the types of science fiction. And I remember that article saying that like the term science fiction was different than sci-fi. Like it meant different things, even if we'd use it interchangeably, just like SF meant something different. And
Yeah.
basically like one is like a hard science fiction, like, and there's people that read the stuff and they just want to read something that whether they know it or not, like is real, like could happen,
Yeah.
is actively happening, like the science of like rocket ships, you know? And like to your point, she's bringing it around to like human stuff. And who knows if this clone thing could happen the way she's describing it. It's like gone off the rails in terms of being actual science. And so
Yeah.
then it just allows you to like actually explore like the human part of it. Cause otherwise, I don't know. Sometimes like when there's no rules, there's no guardrails, and hard science being one of those guardrails, like you could take the story wherever you want. And it's kind of like, that's cool. It's really clever.
Yeah, the science can become magic at a certain point.
Yeah, and at a certain point, it's just kind of like, I don't know, like even fantasy novels about stuff like magic have guardrails in place because that allows like the human element to thrive.
Yeah.
People need rules and confines to like have conflict.
One thing that Brandon Sanderson, who's a well-known fantasy author, but people complain about fantasy stories, science fiction stories, like you can make anything happen. Like you just
Right.
magic all your problems away. His point is that's true of every book. Like Jane Austen could have just made them get married on the first page. She didn't have to like
Sure,
have
sure,
this
sure.
whole thing happen. Ernest Hemingway could have had his revelation on page one. He didn't have to like go through it all. But the point of a story is like watching human beings wrestle with things, right? Or
Right.
figure things out and like get to the point. And like the science or the magic or the accoutrements of the story are just means of doing that. And I think as authors and writers, you have to remember that. Like, got to bring it back to the human. The interesting things that you can explore with science fiction, the interesting things you can explore with fantasy, like creating worlds, they're interesting, thing. But to make it a good story, you got to bring it back to the person, to the human, the character, and explore like feelings and things that are human so that we can connect with them and see them.
What's your takeaway again?
Yeah, my takeaway is basically just I've had the takeaway before when we did some science fiction stuff about like developing a premise and then building from that, seeing where it takes you and stuff like that. And I think I even referenced Daniel Dennett's kind of like he was talking about doing philosophy where you turn the dials on different things. And like the farther you swing the dial over, like what happens to your thought experiment. You can do that with stories too. And science fiction, kind of speculative fiction where you set up a thing and see what happens is a perfect place for that. But my general takeaway for this, I think, is if you're going to do all that, doing all that is wonderful. But one of the keys that Ursula Guin is demonstrating so well here is that you got to always remember that the story should be about human beings and human experiences. It needs to reflect back on human experiences and show us something about ourselves that maybe we wouldn't have been able to look at from this particular angle without the setup that you've created. So projecting out into the future, out into the possibilities and potentials of technology or whatever is very interesting as far as like setting and story go. But to give it heart, to give it like something to say, you got to turn that back around and look inside human experience and what that says.
Right. I mean, it seems so obvious, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, most of our takeaways are pretty obvious.
No, they're not, John. They're all very clever.
People should be paying us $100 an episode for this gold.
We've been saying that for what, 6 years? I think it probably just goes back to what I was saying earlier. It was only in like skimming the ending just now while we were talking that I realized that this calf guy had the potential for love. He just didn't understand what it was, maybe in his context, right? Like in his current world setup, he didn't know what that was. And that was surprising for me as a reader. And like I said, it was also surprising giving all of this setup that the story was going to be about the clones having a human revelation versus like the humans having to contend with something. And this is, I think, probably the first clone science fiction story that we've read on the podcast and probably the first I've read, really.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not like unfamiliar with this concept or anything. Like it's the first I've seen them referred to as like a 12 clone or whatever, right? That's cool and that's unique.
Yeah, it's a different take on cloning.
Yeah, but like that's, I guess, my takeaway is like we talk all the time about how like there's no unique story, especially when it comes to like fiction and you have like man versus man, man versus self, man versus nature. You know, like everything's like been done. And so if you get really caught up in that, you'll be paralyzed by it. There's nothing that you can do that hasn't been done, first of all, and then for you to do it better, like good luck. But if, especially when it comes to sci-fi, like if you're interested in the idea of clones, just like you might be interested in the idea of space travel, like one of the most common premises that we see, you have to take it like a step further. And this one truly like surprised me with the ending. I was like, oh, this is what this is about. It's going to be about this clone like having this revelation. The humans aren't the ones learning about themselves, right? It's almost like a triumph of like humans here.
They do learn about themselves a little bit by teaching the clone, right?
Right. It seemed pretty comfortable in the fact that they were humans and they're like, oh, the clones are coming in. The clones are going to help us. Like they're really good at their job. It's kind of weird that they like hang out this way, but like whatever, because they're good at their job. And then like when the mine blows up, the humans go and save them, you know? And then when the human, whichever one, Martin or Pew is the one that's like in trouble and the other one goes and saves him, you know? It's like the humans are not bad in this story. And that surprised me. What a nice little twist. So my point being, like my takeaway being that there's nothing unique, but if you find yourself interested in something like this, just like what can you do to make it a little bit different or surprising? Like I said, I thought this was a Joseph Conrad story, just with the sci-fi envelope, and it wasn't. So point being, you can there's room for you to surprise in this genre and all genres. So just like, I don't know, don't go with your first idea. That's definitely been a takeaway of mine in the past. Think a little harder.
Oh, yeah. I remember, I forget, this is like 100 years ago. I remember reading someone say, they said, when you're plotting out a story or like coming up with ideas, you're like, where should my novel go next? Or where should my story, or what should happen in this moment to the story? And I'm not sure. Don't go with your first idea.
Right.
Don't go with your second idea. Like maybe the characters can come up with that idea and then there's reasons not to do it. But then the surprising thing is like your 100th idea. It's like the last idea you come up with. That's where your story should go. Because nobody's going to come up with that. Nobody's going to like predict that. And nobody's done it before because nobody sat there discarding the first 99 ideas.
Right. And if you have a shitty idea, you can just make it really human. And then we'll also be surprised.
I mean, literary fiction is like, okay, there's no plot. There's no interesting like twist. It's just, let's dive deep into this character. We should talk about a difference between literary fiction and commercial fiction fiction or genre fiction. Why do we call it literary fiction? Not now. We'll do that some other time.
Not now. Not now. Stop.
This episode might already be too long.
All right. Thanks, guys. If you enjoyed this episode, consider joining our Patreon. Your support helps us keep the show running. Find out more at patreon.com/whyisthisgoodpodcast. And for industry news, writing tips, and great short fiction, join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Naples Writers Workshop. You can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter at napleswritersworkshop.com.